Hi. All right, here we go. I think we're live. I think the audio is working. By now, I should have figured it all out. Hi, everyone. It's glad. I'm glad to see everyone here in the chat already. I'm going to give it a couple of seconds to catch up as the beginning. Well, the whole live stream's kind of lagged for me, but good to see everyone here in the chat. Hi, Ori. Hi, Tommy. Hi, Karthik. Good to see everyone. Hope everyone's having a good weekend. For us here in India, it's almost over. This is the last thing in this weekend, and it was a hectic couple of weeks actually. I've not been able to make a video, find the time, but this is a live stream I've wanted to do for a while now, and I figured here we go. Here I have some time. It is another EISNER game live stream, and I'll explain what that is in just a little bit. Just welcoming everyone, giving everyone a chance to get caught up. The audio works right off the bat. Will miracles ever cease? So this is going to be, I think, a shorter live stream compared to my live streams, which can, depending on the topic and depending on what I'm looking at, can go on for a while. This one I'm estimating is going to take about an hour and a half, 2 hours maximum. And that's because of the EISNER category that we're looking at. So to briefly recap, for those of you not familiar, the EISNER's game is a game that we play on YouTube. I was tagged in this last year by fellow comics YouTuber Blackpole from the Comic Board, who introduced this game as an adaptation of something from the Nebulas and looking at the winners over the years of a particular award and then talking about them based on whether you have read that book or not. And this has been adapted to the EISNER Awards. The EISNER Awards are often called the Oscars of comics, and I've talked in my previous episodes on why that is rather apt. They are an American comic industry award, so US-centric. There are international books that do get nominated in categories. There are some particular categories for international publications, but for the most, it is based in it has to be published in the United States, and I think by either a US publisher or an international publisher who's also operating and publishing in the United States. In past episodes of this game, we have looked at the category for Best Writer and looking at all the Best Writer winners over the years, and then Best Graphic Album, which ended up being a double category because it was Best Graphic Album Reprint and Best Graphic Album New. So there were 2 awards for every year or for most of the years. And that was one of those pretty long live streams. Today, we're going to be looking at Best Reality-Based Work. That's the official name of the category. And I'll talk a little bit later as well about that strange name and whether it's a good fit or what it actually means. I've been referring to this as Best Nonfiction Comic. I do like the term nonfiction, and I think somewhere through the course of this evening, I'll also be trying to touch upon what is nonfiction and what makes nonfiction so special and what differentiates nonfiction from fiction, and how many of those parameters that we create to create the boundaries between fiction and nonfiction actually apply. I mean, this sounds pretty complicated, and it can be because I've been thinking about it for many years in prose as well as in comics. The boundaries between fiction and nonfiction, what constitutes nonfiction, and what gives it its power. If we say it has a different power from fiction, where is that coming from, and what is all of this about? And I thought it would be an interesting exercise to go through these books and look at the type of nonfiction they are and talk about how similar or dissimilar they are from each other and what our ideas of nonfiction are. So something that I'd love to see in the chat as well as in the comments is your opinions on nonfiction and your favorites, of course, books of maybe from this list that you have read, others that you enjoy. I've often said on this channel, that I think almost 50% or 40% of my library at home of comics is made up of nonfiction. And it was something that was interesting for me to discover. I didn't realize it had gone that way. And I think when I started reading comics or started rereading comics as an adult, it was fiction. It was mainly fiction, the first kind of surge of reading that I was doing. But there were some key nonfiction titles in there. And because of those, I wanted to read other stuff written by and drawn by the same creators who did those nonfiction works that I did read. And a lot of them ended up being people who work almost exclusively with nonfiction. And so, therefore, finding everything that creator or creators had done resulted in me reading a lot of nonfiction, often by the same creators. But that led to other creators, the way comics do. You read collaborations and then you read individual works by those collaborators or their collaborations with other people, and you can easily go, hopping from title to title, from book to book, from creator to creator, and discover. And that's what happened with me with nonfiction, to the point where I realized that a lot of what was on my shelves was indeed nonfiction. So this makes me think that, okay, this category, I should do well in this category because it is a game. And I'll explain a little bit about the game as well. There is a scoring system. So the way the game was explained and the way previous iterations of this game have been played is we go through the nominations. No, we don't go through the nominations. We go through the winners. We go through a list of winners for every year. And I say, and you along with me, whether you're watching this live or watching a recording of this later, you say whether we have read it. So we give ourselves 1 point for having read that work. And we give ourselves 1 point for owning a copy of that book. And it's there in part of our home libraries. So every category with one winner would mean that there's a maximum of 2 points to get, 1 for having read and 1 for having owned. So, of course, there may be books that you have read, but you don't own them. Maybe you read them borrowed from a friend or a library, or you used to own them and then decided to get rid of it for some reason. And in past games, there have been a couple of those, particularly when talking about certain editions. There's also the possibility that one owns something because they have bought it, but they have yet to get to it. So then they would have a point for owning, but for not having read it. So you could have a maximum of 2, you could have a minimum of 0, and you could have 1 for either of those categories. Shortly, what I'm going to do is pull up an Excel sheet. It's not an Excel sheet. I wanted to keep that in mind, and of course I forgot. It's Google Sheets. I'm going to pull up a Google Sheet on which I've already pre-populated these titles. We're going to go through them year by year. I'll score myself. You can keep score along with me, and we'll talk a little bit about which of them I've read, which of them I haven't, what I think of them. And the reason why I'm speculating that this might be a relatively short or relatively shorter live stream is the best nonfiction category, or to use its official name, best reality-based work, hasn't existed for the entire history of the EISNERs. And certain awards were introduced later. And I think the awards, the EISNERs in their current... Now, I'm trying to remember from earlier live streams, but I think in their current form, the EISNERs had their first awards in 1988. So when looking at Best Writer and Best Graphic Album, we saw Watchmen and The Killing Joke sort of starting it off in a couple of those categories. So 88, 89 is when those categories existed, for example. But Best Reality-Based Work only was introduced as a category in 2006. So from 2006 to 2021, it's only been around for 16 years. And so therefore, we will only be looking at 16 years worth of winners, which is why I think this may not go as long. I did consider going through the nominations as well, but that I think would have exponentially made it longer, because there are some very interesting, and it's a thing that I've talked about before and we've discussed before, that we have to say that it would exponentially increase the number of books we're talking about, but it is fun to look at awards, and it is fun to look at awards nominations to see who else was nominated in the year that this won. Now, that I think is a separate exercise, and there are certain nominations where I'm very surprised, just out of my personal opinion on the works, to see that this was up against this. And there are some other questions again about this question of what is nonfiction and what all classifies as nonfiction, that I think comes across very interestingly looking at the nominations. If you look at just the winners, you might think that this is how all the other works were. So if you're looking at the biography of a historical figure, you might think all the other nominations must have also been similar. Or if you're looking at autobiography or a memoir, you might think, but to have them compete against each other and to see the diversity in the subject matter that they're approaching, and then to see them in competition, it's very interesting. It is a little funny the way that all awards, I think, are to say this is better than that or this is a winner. So I don't want us to be too serious about the winners. It's just a way, as I always say, it's just a way to talk about more comics and to exchange opinions. And that's another thing that, as a caveat, I don't want to say right off the start of the episode. I always say that just because we're looking at awards or a particular award, that's in no way to indicate that the awards somehow make something worthy or something not worthy, that this work is not a great work or a worthy work because it won an award. So it's not supposed to be a barometer of absolute value, if such a thing exists. It's just a way, it's a tool to look at books and talk about books. And also, even though there will be scoring, it's a lighthearted scoring. That's just what makes it a game. But you shouldn't think, if you haven't read a certain number of works, that you've got such a low score and that's somehow inferior to someone who's read more. It's really not a question of better or worse. It's just an interesting thing. And that's another thing of looking at the nominations. I may find that I've read this work, and that's the winner for the year, for example, but I've read none of the other 4 nominations. And there may be someone else who's read 3 out of those 5 nominations, but not read the winner. It can get really arbitrary, but again, it's all in fun. And so I think it's about time to get started. Just hi for everyone who's joined after the start. I was just going through the usual caveats, disclaimers, explaining what this game is about for those of you who haven't been here before. So we're about to get started. Grab yourself your drinks and snacks. I have mine. This is water in a jug, because it was insinuated in the last live stream that it was some sort of spurious alcohol that I was secretly drinking. But in order to prove that's not the case, I do have real alcohol with me this time. So I've got myself a little glass of whiskey because it's 10:30 on a Sunday after a tough couple of weeks. So I'm estimating I've got about 5 sips in here. So the way I'm going to incentivize myself to get through this quickly is I'll take a sip every 3 nominations I go through, and so 5 or 6 sips. So I don't know how it's going to work out by the end of it, but I said I'm not going to take my first sip until I'm done with the caveats and disclaimers and all of that stuff, which I'm approaching. And then every 3 books or every 3 years, I'll take a sip, and hopefully that'll be my smoothing out into the rest of the evening. So if we're ready to get started, I'm just going to hi, welcome everyone. Comic Bound, good to see you. Eric, good to see you. Revanji, Nikki, Abhilash, Unia. Excellent panels with Pete is here. Excellent. First live stream, welcome. All right, so looking at the category, let me see if this screen thing works now, of course. It is, yes, it does seem to be, I'm on some other document. A little bit of a peek forward. I was just checking to see if everything works, but all right, here we go. Let's try it again. All right. So I've got this sheet up here. I'm going to be throwing, I'm just going to be filtering down on the years and get started with looking at best reality based work. And the very first book to win this award in 2006 was Nat Turner by Kyle Baker. And Nat Turner is actually the first Kyle Baker book that I read. I'd read some shorts by Kyle Baker. I'd seen shorts of his anthologized and in magazines. I'd also seen illustrations by him, which I think were magazine covers or comics covers. I'd, of course, heard about his run on Plastic Man, and I'd seen it, but I had not yet read Plastic Man. So I knew that he was famous as a comedic creator, as a comedy comics, which is what Plastic Man is. And I knew that, but Nat Turner is the story of a slave rebellion, a very bloody and violent slave rebellion. And I was a little surprised to hear Kyle Baker had written and drawn a book on this uprising. Now, I didn't know a lot about it. It was just stuff you get from pop culture. But I did pick up this book many years ago. Nat Turner, this is the complete edition. I believe that this was self-published by Kyle Baker in 4 parts as a mini-series. And the 4 parts are in this book as 4 chapters. But this is the complete Nat Turner, which is simply it's a spectacular comic. I have to confess that not knowing anything about the story other than the fact that it was about a slave uprising, I wasn't sure. This is it without the dust jacket, very handsome volume. But I wasn't sure what to expect because, again, what I had seen of Kyle Baker's art was cartoony and exaggerated in a very comedic way. And that was the second thing when I opened this book and looked at the art style, which is done in black and white in this terrific. You can see that there are exaggerations. You can see that there are shapes and edges that are not necessarily photorealistic, but you wouldn't consider this Plastic Man cartoony by any means. And the next thing that surprised me about this book is that it is essentially a textless, wordless book. It is, as I said, extremely violent. It's very graphic, although I suppose the borders of what is graphic do keep changing. You have text in the form of sound effects like this every now and then. And you have prose sections, which are actually taken from memoirs and Nat Turner's own confession, because this slave rebellion that he led was quashed in 2.5 days. He was put on trial and he was executed. And while he was on trial and awaiting execution, he talked extensively with someone, a biographer, who published his confessions shortly after, and that has served as a primary text on him alongside others. But the story of Nat Turner, the book, begins long before Nat Turner, the character, shows up. It starts with his mother being captured in Africa and brought to the United States on slave ships. And the violence starts right there. Throughout the book, you have extremely dramatic, very tense, and very graphically presented situations that are still very stylish, very moody. It's a very interesting approach where you definitely have cartoony exaggeration, not just in the figures, but in the type. Whenever there is, this is one of the rare cases where you get a word balloon, for example. That's not really the case for most of this book. And then you have sections which explain to you that everything that you're seeing depicted here by Kyle Baker is based on Nat Turner's confessions, on Nat Turner's language, but you also get his language, or at least the way it was transcribed by the gentleman interviewing him. The second sense that built up for me, again, as a person who knew absolutely nothing, is just how well educated Nat Turner had made himself. As someone forbidden to learn to read and write, as slaves were in those days, he learned to read and write secretly. But by the time he's giving these confessions, although I suppose some of it can be license on the part of the person writing it down, but it's extremely eloquent. It's very high diction. He has definitely captured the language of the masters and is able to wield it to talk about himself with this alarming honesty and nakedness, which is all presented over here in just an unforgettable combination of the artwork and the text. The violence in this book isn't, and for those of you who know about this, it won't be anything new, but the violence in this book isn't only the violence against the slaves or against the Africans. The revolution that Nat Turner leads is a very violent, I'm trying to find something that won't be absolutely horrific to look at. Although, I'm probably making it sound like a gory sort of title. That's not what it is. It's again, the implication of what you're seeing and the manner in which you're seeing it, rather than absolute. You do have violence, but you do have it presented in comics form through juxtaposition and through insinuation. A lot of it is, the power does come from that. But what I was saying was the revolt is a bloody massacre of white families as well, including women and children. In fact, what was interesting is that the way this comic put it across, there's a child being beheaded right here, which I'm not going to put on the screen. But the way that it is depicted, the savagery of the violence it just seems like a cycle. It seems like this endless cycle, because violence begets violence, which begets violence. So by the time you get to the conclusion of the story, I don't think Nat Turner comes across as a hero, but is definitely a significant. I mean, it's interesting to see how people would translate that, because the violence committed is perhaps inexcusable, but perhaps it is completely excusable. And some would say, reading this book, you're not going to condone the violence, but you will understand where it comes from, and you understand what kind of a situation people feel they're in, or how they could possibly extricate themselves from it. But it's complex. And I think the lack of text and the lack of editorializing text in particular makes this a very interesting nonfiction work, because of that reliance on primary sources, because of extracting those primary sources. It's like a documentary in that part, but the stylish, moody, and expressive depiction of the art is like a Hollywood movie. So it's that incredible blend of rigid documentary, these are the words that were said by that person, and then the creative visualization of it that make Nat Turner such an interesting work. And if you're familiar with Kyle Baker's work on DC or other comics with a superhero genre and aren't aware of this, I would strongly recommend you check it out, because it's absolutely revelatory. And I'd be interested in seeing how people react to the violence and the depiction of violence in this, which I think, as I've said now a couple of times, is graphic but stylish, is something that is aggressive towards the reader, but still seems to have a grip of understanding within us. It's a very interesting combination of things that are quite far apart from the reader's point of view. So that is Kyle Baker's Nat Turner from 2006. I was going to reach for my whiskey, but it isn't time yet. Sleepy Reader, good to see you here. Yes, it's superb. I think you're in the United States where all of these books are easily available. You may even be able to pick up the 4 original miniseries from a place like My Comic Shop. I mean, this combined edition, or the 4-in-1, the complete edition, I think is very easy to find. I don't think it's out of print. It's available in hardcover and paperback, so there's a range of prices. Absolutely worth checking out. Okay, so that was Nat Turner from 2006. Let's see what we've got next. Oh, right, I've got to score myself. So what I do over here is I give myself 1 point for having read it and 1 point for owning it. So my score is 2 out of a possible 2. I do have a total going over there, but that's going to disappear as soon as my first line goes away. So first year done, 2006, Nat Turner by Kyle Baker. Moving on to 2007, Fun Home by Alison Bechdel, which is probably a very famous comic. I wouldn't be surprised if everyone has heard of it. Maybe not everyone has read it, but Alison Bechdel's work, Fun Home, and her long-running comic strip Dykes to Watch Out For, are her work has almost gone past comics, where it's cultural commentary. She's a speaker and I'm trying to remember all the awards and all the distinguished merits that she has received, but she is a cultural commentator in many ways, and also a comics artist, and that's the comics work that gives her that the Bechdel test is something that comes out of one of her comic strips, which I think a lot of people use in talking about film, people who've never read anything by Alison Bechdel. Fun Home was her first full-length work. It is a memoir. It is an autobiography. So already between 2006 and 2007, you can see the disparity that comes into a category being titled reality-based work. One is a historical period piece with research. The other is a story of one's own life and childhood. I think Fun Home might also be very, it might be known now because there was a stage musical based on this book, which was, I think, quite successful and won awards. I haven't seen the stage musical, but I have read the book. So this is Fun Home by Alison Bechdel. This is, as I said, this is an autobiography, and it's difficult to try to encapsulate what it's about. Not difficult because it's about so many things, but if I just give you the 2 or 3 lines, it's I don't know. Let's give it a shot. Alison Bechdel's Fun Home is an autobiography of her growing up and coming of age in a very unusual, dysfunctional family situation. Her father is the director of a funeral home, which is where the title Fun Home comes from. So Fun Home is what the kids shorten it to, and it's also a sarcastic remark because it's not a fun place. That home is not a fun place. He is the director of a funeral home, and he is an English teacher in a school, and he is a closeted gay man, and he never comes out of his closet. He's closeted till the day he dies, although there's plenty suggesting the repression, and that is part of what the young daughter he has sees. She is also she also comes out as a lesbian towards the end of high school, and he is not happy about that. The dynamics between the father and the daughter, and their extremely troubled and dysfunction seems to be a cheap word in some ways, but it's a good catch-all. But the relationship that they share is such a complicated and barbed one. And this book apparently took 6 years for Alison Bechdel to make. And that's because of the incredible amount of research, and I'll explain what I mean by research, and the art style, which is very detailed, very realistic in the way that it is full. It is crammed full of things, but she apparently used a lot of photo reference. And I don't mean looking at old photographs. The way that she drew it is she posed for every pose herself, took a photograph of herself and drew it in order to write this story. There's also a lot of journal entries, diary entries that she was keeping at that time that she extracts from. It's done in this black and white and blue wash style that gives it both a sort of, it's not like sepia tone, which automatically creates nostalgia and old timiness. This definitely can have nostalgia, but it's also a little clinical. It's also a little cool. It doesn't have that nice warmth that sepia does, which is very appropriate for this dense text on family. The other thing about this book is, or the story, I mean, there are lots of things about the story, but her father did commit suicide. But it's not clear if it was a suicide or not for the whole world. He stepped in front of a bus or a truck. Alison was there when it happened, and she believes it was a suicide. And she believes that his life of repression just got to him. And the kind of behavior that he exhibited in his house, the kind of control over his family, over his children, over his wife, the kind of temper and the rage that he had were all sort of symptoms of that. And it's interesting how in this story you've got this reversal of father and daughter as she moves towards openness and honesty and acceptance, and his anger at that. You can draw the lines, but what's, I think, the most interesting thing and the most impressive thing about Fun Home is the author draws those lines for you. And the author draws those lines by remembering scenes and then remembering scenes differently. And so it's like those movie sequences where you have the actors play it out one way, then you have the actors play it out a different way, depending on whose story is being remembered. And this sort of honesty in that archaeology is also coupled. Alison Bechdel takes literature, particularly Greek mythology and the classics, and every chapter of this book has a literary reference or allusion in it. And now this could be pretentious, and some people might say that it is, but I feel that she does such a great job of connecting to those themes, connecting those themes in the literature she was reading at the time, that she has read since, and the kind of connections that she was making, familial and one's about relationships, one's about sexuality, one's about identity, and the way that she arranges her life to see if it fits that way, and it doesn't, and it's not quite the same thing. And then she asks a question, and she reinterprets the literature, and then she reinterprets life, and she reinterprets the moment. That constant analysis and that constant examination of how she thought her dad was a sissy and how her dad thought that she should be more feminine. These kind of very basic things start taking on larger and larger resonance when you realize what the story is about. Fun Home is not an easy book to read, although I don't think it's hard or dense in the way that some other heavily literary referential reading is hard. I mean, some of it is hard simply because the situation in this family is such a tough one. Some ways it's hard because you feel the cruelty on, being visited on a child who doesn't really understand and who has got to then learn to understand and sort of learn to create their identity when surrounded by lies. It's also funny at times, and you almost feel bad for laughing, but it's so well observed that the humor fits right into that higher I mean, I wouldn't call it melodramatic, but that higher tragic drama. So this is, yes, that's. I was seeing if I remembered it correctly. The subtitle of Fun Home is a family tragicomic, and apart from the pun on comic, it really is. It feels like a classic family tragedy, and that's why the allusions to Greek mythology and Greek literature particularly resonate, but it's much more than that. It's not as big and fat as you would think something like this would be. I think when we think about something like Blankets, that's 600 pages, it's huge. I think there's sometimes a tendency to think about these very big, deep, plumbing the depths of family dysfunction, these kind of stories, we think about them as these giant epics. And looking back on it, I was surprised at how much is packed into. I mean, it's not a slim book, but it's not by any means a fat book. How much density? When I remember it, when I remember everything that it's about, it seems like a much bigger book in my memory than this. I highly recommend Fun Home. There is a follow up that she has, which is another memoir, and that's about her relationship with her mother. If you enjoy this, that's something you could check out. I don't think that's at the level of this. This is something quite spectacular, and depending on your patience for analysis and literary referentiality, I don't want it to sound like it's only reference. It's a way of using literature and a way of using stories to try to interpret your life and try to interpret reality. And that part of it, I think, is bigger than just this story. And I think that's what makes the story brilliant, is that's how most autobiography is. We could extend it to say that's the way most writing is, or that's the way most storytelling is. It's making sense or trying to interpret, or even if you think it can't be interpreted, it's trying to say this is chaos that can't be interpreted through storytelling. And that's why reality-based work is such an interesting title. Isn't everything sort of reality-based? I'm being facetious, of course, but the memoir over here that we are seeing, and the historical drama that we saw before this, Kyle Baker's Nat Turner, both of them, they are making a story. You've got some prose sections, but what Kyle Baker is doing in the visualization of that revolt and the history of these families is storytelling, and he's creating a story. And here you see someone struggling to create a story, trying to make sense of what's going on, and then using this book not as therapy, but as a culmination of all of that examination. Very, very touching, very incisive, explicit, but in the best ways. This is how explicitness should be done. It's about rawness and it's about honesty, but it's also about not being honest. It's also about keeping things secret and keeping things hidden, and the kind of damage that does. Superb work, very well deserving of its reputation. Fun Home by Alison Bechdel. All right. All right, let's see what we have here. Do we have any questions? Sleepy Reader says sometimes they say fiction is lies that get at the truth. Does that make memoir the reverse? It's a very good question. And I think this is one of those questions about fiction and nonfiction that I love fiction. Anyone who knows me knows I love fiction. And when people say, isn't it frivolous, etc., I really don't think they're getting the point. It's like, yes, they are lies. It is made up stuff, but as being said, it's lies to get to the truth. And certain fiction, like Vonnegut's Cat's Cradle, where you have an entire religion about lies and saying, yes, you've got to live by the lies that make you happy. But nonfiction, is that the reverse? That's why I like the idea of nonfiction, because the idea of calling it fact or calling it reportage or calling it the truth, etc., it's not true. I don't know whether it's true or not. I think the only difference, and maybe we can get into this deeper, the only difference between fiction and nonfiction is trust. And you trust someone is telling you the truth. You trust that they've done research. You trust that they're still going to edit. They're still going to choose moments to show you and choose moments not to show you. Their research is an entire ocean, perhaps, but they're going to edit it. They're going to finesse it. It's always going to be a story that's presented. There's a faith, that there's a pact that the reader makes with the writer to say that, all right, you're not going to make stuff up completely. And there have been a lot of famous controversies about this. I think the most famous one might be Truman Capote's In Cold Blood, which is, till today, I think most people will say it was the first true crime bestseller, or it was a true crime classic. And by true crime, they're also insinuating that it is nonfiction, which is just always been presented as. But there is a scene right at the end of it, which never took place, which never had these people there. They never said these things. It just didn't happen. And Truman Capote said that he made it up because the story needed it, and that's how it. And he's fine with it. So, is In Cold Blood fiction because that scene didn't happen? We see these things with movies, of course. We see these in dramatizations, even in books. Where you have things that are based in fact, but then there is a certain kind of. But I would say in that case, just to get back to that earlier point, is that it makes it the same thing, is that those things are also lies that get at the truth, just like fiction does. It's just they're using the same tools. The pact or the contract may be different. I think there might be more. There might be more. All right. So that is 2 years down out of the ones that we've been looking at so far. That's 2006 and 2007. Moving on to 2008. Oh, wait, I've got a score. Right. So I have read it. I own it. 2 out of 2. Nice. So far, so good. Moving on to 2008. In 2008, the winner for the best reality-based work, EISNER, was Satchel Paige, striking out Jim Crow by James Sturm and Rich Tomaso. Now, I am a fan of James Sturm, and I only heard about this book last year. I've recently read a couple of things by Rich Tomaso, but this was an excellent read. It's a small, short, little story. It is the Eisner winner for best nonfiction, for best reality-based work, and it is the story. Can we focus? Yeah. It's the story of Satchel Paige, a legendary pitcher who was black, played in the Negro League, but one of the longest baseball careers, and played in the Depression era, Jim Crow laws, South of the United States, among other places. And this story is written by James Sturm, whose Market Day, The Golem's Mighty Swing, Off Season, I've talked about on this channel, and drawn by Rich Tomaso. In this black and white, but with sepia, now fitting this dusty Depression era story of this baseball pitcher. And the interesting thing is, this is not a story of Satchel Paige's life. It doesn't go birth to death like many biographies do. And it's not even for an extended period of his life. This is sort of towards the end of his career. But the story is broken into 2 parts, which are 2 baseball games. And the first baseball game takes place years before the second baseball game. The first baseball game features a young black sharecropper who goes to play and finds himself facing the legendary Satchel Paige. And in this game, he decides that he is going to beat this famous pitcher. And what he does and the risks he takes gets them the victory, but gets him an injury that takes him out of baseball completely. Many years later, he takes his son to watch a baseball game in which Satchel Paige and an all-black team are playing an all-white team in the segregated South. And this simple little two-game story works incredibly effectively. It is Satchel Paige striking out Jim Crow is an absolute crowd pleaser of a book. I'm not, and I've said this I think a couple of times, I'm not a fan of baseball, the sport. I've tried to watch it. I've never really gotten into it. Like with many sports, I enjoy it when I'm watching it with someone who's really into it and can explain it to me. But I really like stories about baseball, particularly prose, comics, and movies. They have something that they're able to, what I don't see in the game, they're able to make the game into a metaphor for things. And this might be one of the finest examples I've seen in which racism and oppression are being fought, but they're being fought on the field. And the way that this game unfolds, the score and who scores off whom, and how the players are getting riled up, and what people in the crowd are doing, and what this poor black sharecropper sitting there with his son, has as a resentment or as a what could have been in his mind. But he's over there watching this game now, 20 years, 10 years afterwards, where the person who was already a legend when he played him is still playing and is still resisting on the baseball field, is still resisting the things that are happening with superb art. That I'd shared a panel from this, I think, last year on the YouTube community page, asking people to guess who the artist was. And I think 7 or 8 people said Seth. And it's absolutely understandable why, because it feels very much like Seth. And I didn't know that Rich Tomaso's style, I've seen, as I said, a couple of his books, and it's incredible the kind of range that he has. But James Sturm's writing and Rich Tomaso's art together in this book create something really, really interesting. It sort of echoes as I said, like a crowd-pleasing movie. It makes you want to stand up and cheer, but at the same time, it's so, it's just that moment. It's just that game. The world doesn't change because of it, or does it? And that's, I think, that the reason why this slim little play-by-play, inning by inning, ball by ball kind of story is so tense and so incredible, is that by the end of it, by the end of this game, you do feel as if things have changed. You do feel as if a difference has been made somehow. And that's what makes it such an alluring story. Lovely work, Satchel Paige striking out Jim Crow by James Sturm and Rich Tomaso. My question about this book is completely unrelated to its merits, which I think are considerable. This is, of course, it's based in history. And I think the 2 games that were played over here were played exactly the way that there's notes over here, and it tells you at the back a history of Satchel Paige, of these times. But there is also let me see. Yes, there's also a fair amount of creative license taken over here in a frame story, and what a father is saying to a son. These things are not things on the record. These are not things that are coming from reality. What you do have is the game. What you do have is the history of the person, but the exact details are fiction, I would say. That does not detract from what the story is about, but when looking at things that are purely autobiographical, but the same things can happen. Is that, are you remembering that scene exactly as it happened? Were there exactly that number of people at the dinner table? Are you sure the political conversation? It's one of those things that you feel when you read novels about, or even autobiographies, not fiction, but when you read autobiographies about childhood, and then you have an exchange of dialogue taking place, you're like, is this verbatim? Can it possibly be verbatim? Can you remember the names of everyone who was there if you were 6 years old? Somewhere, even in nonfiction, we have this understanding that certain things are going to be made up, certain things are going to be manufactured, but not maliciously so, because you have that pact. And I think this is a good example of it. When I read it, I didn't think it was nonfiction. One, because it felt so gripping and it felt so immediate that it didn't feel like here's a story of something that happened a long time ago. It felt very moment by moment, which is exactly the way it is engineered, as a very moment by moment immediate reading. But thinking about it as a nonfiction work, given the frame story and given the stuff that surrounds the game and the reactions to it, I have to wonder. I have to wonder if this classifies as nonfiction. I don't care as long as it's a good story, but I do wonder about the boundaries of nonfiction. Or maybe I'm missing something here. Maybe everything about the sharecropper and his son was on the record and is something known to us and is a true story. But I don't think so. I think the games are true. I think what happened in the game, the score, the people who are playing, all of that stuff is true. But the fact that the story is being told to us by a fictional character talking to a fictional son, I think is the thing that I would have a question about. But this is the winner for the next year, Satchel Paige, Striking Out Jim Crow by James Sturm and Rich Tomaso. Okay, I think I have the air conditioner on because the last live stream was so warm that I felt it's time for this. The last live stream was so warm, I figured I couldn't do it without an air conditioner, but I don't think I'm going to have to. I was worried about the noise that it makes, which is unfortunately quite a lot, but hopefully I'm cutting stuff out in the mic. All right, 3 books down, first sip of the whiskey down, water. Let's see what we have. Let's see what we have next. All right. 2008, moving on to 2009. What It Is by Linda Barry. Now, this is a book that I read relatively recently. In fact, I had it featured in one of my recent reads and new acquisitions videos where I was talking about how I've wanted to read more Linda Barry, but I've never found more than a couple. And that's not technically true, and I'll tell you why. I've seen her books available, and this is the book that we're talking about right now, What It Is, and a lot of Linda Barry looks like this, and not just this in the cover. Let me show you up close. This is an autobiography that looks like this. It is definitely comics, but it's very unusual and different presentation of comics. Not all of Linda Barry is like this. I've read several of her earlier stories that are more traditional comics, or let's say the figures. Oh, no, sorry, I went back to. Let's say the figures you see here, you'll see those figures in panels, and they'll be moving from panel to panel, and you'll have 9, 6, 8 panels a page layout, fairly traditional. This book, it does not take that traditional approach, and a lot of Linda Barry books don't take that traditional approach. As she's grown as a comics writer and creator, she has really explored different angles of how to put words and images together. And I understand that this might not be to everyone's taste. This is a little bit more traditional, maybe only relatively. Yeah, but this is an autobiography. Sorry, this is. All right, sorry about that. I will have to turn the air conditioner up because it's so warm in here right now. This is an autobiography about becoming a writer or becoming an artist and wanting to express herself. But it also ties in a psychological approach, not just what happened to me in my life, what I was doing, what I liked, it's not a traditional autobiography of just repeating what had happened, but it's also very much sort of a journal of thinking right now. And that's why I think something like this is a little harder to read for some people, because if you're expecting the storytelling to come across in one way, it might seem jarring if it has crayon drawings and multimedia and paper cutout. But there are a number of people. I mean, Linda Barry is far from the only person who does that. And there are a number of people who take this approach to varying levels. What I found about what it is to be accessible is that if you read it, if you just start reading it without worrying too much about how it's laid out and what style it's using, and I don't mean that as in it doesn't matter. Of course it matters. But if you just read it like you normally would, start at this corner and move from left to right, move from top to bottom, you will be very clear on what's going on. This is not dense. This is not pretentious. And I use that to mean this is not about other things that you have to look up. There's not a lot of allusion as far as thematic echoing is concerned. It's just straight up, this is what I'm thinking, this is what I'm seeing, this is what I'm hearing, and this is what I'm thinking because of that. So in spite of the way it looks, and for some people, I think it will be attractive, and I've grown to be really attracted to it myself. It's fairly accessible, which is perhaps not the first impression that it gives. I think the work that I've read of her tells me that Linda Barry is very interested in what makes an artist an artist. Not just the stuff that they've gone through, but how they look at things, how they want to approach things. And when she talks about storytelling, it's equally that. It's about what you're thinking of and what you're feeling about life that affects you as a writer, which can, again, be a heady concept for some people, and for some people it might be just what they're looking for. At the very least, I think that Linda Barry's worth checking out. I mean, I think she's incredibly respected, incredibly renowned, but it would be a pity if it was only art house critique that looked at her work. I really think that once you get over the unfamiliarity of it, you will find it very accessible if you give it a chance. So that is all right. Someone's making funny comments about the time I'm taking. I'm moving along pretty quickly, I think. But I will say over here, did I score myself for 2009? No, did I score myself for 2008 is what I meant to ask. Let me do this one first. Let me go check 2008. Satchel Paige. Yes, I did forget. There we go. Now I'm suspicious about every year. Did I do 2007? Yes, I did. All right. So 2007, 2008, 2009. Moving on to 2010. A Drifting Life by Yoshihiro Tatsumi. And here is a book that I have not read and I do not own. And it's not for a lack of trying. I've gotten a couple of Tatsumi books. Drawn and Quarterly did bring them out, but they didn't seem to stay in print very long, or maybe I just got to know about them a little late. But I've heard this is a fantastic book. I've read mainly short stories by Tatsumi that have been collected in these volumes by Drawn and Quarterly. These are American editions and they are published. No, wait, maybe I'm misremembering. I'll have to look at The Pushman and Other Stories. I think they are published in the Japanese style. They are published from with the spine facing the right. But A Drifting Life is a book I've never been able to get my hands on. It is it is badly out of print. I'm hoping that it is reprinted soon. That's what I'm hoping for a number of the Tatsumi books that I haven't been able to get my hands on. But unfortunately, all I know about it is that it's fantastic. And I have no doubt, given the power of what I've read. But this is an autobiography. So it's not fiction, obviously, because we're in the category. So we've got another memoir. And from what I can remember hearing about it, I think it's a longer autobiography than than something. Well, no, I was thinking of fiction, but it's very different. Obviously, I think this is a much more straight up standard autobiography of life than the kind of memoir that Linda Barry's book is. But in this case, I'm going to have to give myself a 0 for both of them and move on to the next year, unfortunately. Maybe one day it will be reprinted, maybe one day soon. All right, 2011 is It Was the War of the Trenches by Jacques Tardy. I don't think if you're a regular viewer of this channel, you know that I'm a big fan of Jacques Tardy, and I do have this book. And I've talked about it in detail in my Jacques Tardy 17 Comics by Jacques Tardy video. It Was the War of the Trenches is with Tatsumi winning in 2010 and War of the Trenches winning in 2011. You've got a little bit of a rarity here where you've got two non-American creators winning the EISNER. And that's because they were published by American publishers, Drawn and Quarterly in the case of Tatsumi, Fantagraphics in the case of It Was the War of the Trenches. And It Was the War of the Trenches was a recent work. So what are we talking about over here? 2011? 2011, I think this was published in French in 2010 or 2011. So this was unlike the other books of Tardy that Fantagraphics was publishing throughout. This was immediate or close to immediate with its publication. So therefore, it's not a reprint of a classic title the way that, where is it now? Of course, I will not. The way that this other book was, which is Goddamn This War, which was something Tardy did in the 70s. Now, Goddamn This War and It Was the War of the Trenches were put together, and I think this has been reprinted now, this little slipcase thing. So you can get both of his World War I classics in that box set. But even by itself, this is a superb, magnificent book. This is based on the lives of soldiers in World War I. The detailed research on this is the reason why this is sometimes cited as with two authors, although it's all Tardy, but the research is tremendous. And the soldiers that we see here, as I talked about in my video, we follow these soldiers on a chapter by chapter basis based on their experience. So not all chapters are the same length, depending on how early the soldier met his death, for example. So in some cases, it's a 2-page story. In some cases, it's 8 or 9 pages long. But with Tardy's incredible art and detail, these stories are some of the hardest hitting war stories or anti-war stories that you'll read. And not just because of the unflinching look at the violence and the gore, but the manner in which the soul is stripped out of people and stripped out of nations, populations, not just the soldiers, is inescapable when you read this. It has some gut punch moments and then incredible moments of quiet mixed in together. It's fantastic stuff. I've talked about this. Check out that video of mine if you want to get a look at the pages of this and any other Tardy. But It Was the War of the Trenches for 2011. All right. What do we have? Have you read Charlie's War? Eric asks. Yes, I have, thanks to Paul Hatcher in Northampton, who sent it to me in that last box of comics that I opened, ending 2021 with a big box of comics, I think was the name of that video. But yes, well, I haven't read all of it because I think it continues. I've read up to volume 4, which is what I got in that package. If War in the Trenches is an anti-war. So Eric asks if that is an anti-war comic, what would I consider a war comic? I think that's a good question. I think most of what I consider war comics are anti-war comics, but there are gung-ho war comics, that are just about heroism and beating a villainous force, evil force that needs to be stopped. They don't have to be true war comics, I suppose. I grew up reading a lot of comics that were, there was a series called Commando comics, and they were just war stories. And some of them were gripping and some of them were less gripping. They were all really well drawn. And I think a lot of people here in India, at least, really liked the realism they had to them, as opposed to superhero comics or children's funny animal comics. But not all of them were anti-war necessarily. A lot of them seemed justified. There were darker ones, but there were lighter ones. So I guess I guess it's those kind. But you're right. I haven't read much that I would classify as an outright hooray war book. But there are presentations as war being a necessary evil or a force of good, a crusade against evil, that kind of stuff, which I don't think questions or puts the questioning of whether there should be war at all to the back, focusing more on the heroism of certain kinds of things. But you're not going to make a war comic or a war story gripping if it isn't hell in some way or the other. So I agree with that as well, that there's absolutely an aspect to this is terrible. But I mean, I remember it's interesting because I remember reading All Quiet on the Western Front when I was young, and Eric Marais Remarque had that epigraph at the beginning, which I still remember to this day, where he says that this is not meant to be this is not meant to be that, and most of all, it's not meant to be an adventure, because war is not an adventure to those who face it. And that made an impression on me as a kid. But it must mean that some people out there are writing that war is an adventure. War is it's just like those shipwrecked island kind of stories. It's like resilience and make do, and there's a certain romanticism to being, it's like dangerous camping or something like that. I don't know. But I feel like he wouldn't have written that if there weren't people out there putting across war as an adventure. Most probably someone who'd never been to war, never experienced war, and sort of writing from a safe distance with just ideas of the kind of stuff that Arms and the Man by George Bernard Shaw is about. You've got all this poetry about war being written by people who aren't fighting in the trenches. All right. So, but yes, that was 2011 it was the War of the Trenches, giving myself a point there. And moving on. Wait, what's 2000? Do I get to take a sip of whiskey? Oh, no, I got to do one more. I think I have to do one more. Okay. 2012. Green River Killer, a true detective story by Jeff Jensen and Jonathan Case. This is a book, again, that I've read very recently. In fact, this was a book I was looking for some years ago, and it was out of print. It wasn't available. There were some copies used available in the United States, but nothing that I could get my hands on here. And then I saw that it had been reprinted. And in fact, I watched a couple of YouTube videos on this. Off my shelves had a video on Green River Killer. So I was very happy to see it reprinted, because that allowed me to pick up this book, which I was very happy with. It's a true detective story. It's a true serial killer investigation story. And like my favorite ones, it's a procedural. It's very procedural. This is not romanticized. This is not a Hollywood. I mean, it's a true story, but it's also a very unique point of view because Jeff Jensen, the writer of this book, is the son of the lead detective on this case. And so he watched his father go through this. And this investigation took a long time. It was, I don't know if it's classified as a cold case, but it was a case that was still open with no solution for many, many years. And the author's involvement in it, obliquely, is an interesting angle. It's also interesting. Many years ago, I used to read Entertainment Weekly, the magazine, and Jeff Jensen was a writer for Entertainment Weekly. I remember reading his reviews. So I did not know that he had gotten into comics and was an Eisner winner for Best Nonfiction, but this is great. And the art by Jonathan Case is clean and direct, very pleasing. It's a black and white comic, as you can see. It's a stark book about heinous crimes, but it is not graphic. It is not gratuitous. Wait, I'm going the opposite direction. It's not gratuitous. A lot of the violence, most of the violence actually happens off screen. There are descriptions of the violence and some oblique images, but nothing that we would... It's, again, the creepiness factor, the stuff that gets under your skin. But it doesn't dwell too much on the lascivious or the titillating, the way that there could be a danger of serial killer books doing, because it's so procedural, because it's so much about the investigation and following the trail and the paper, etc. That gives it that gives it this kind of dry powder sort of incendiariness. What's also very interesting about this is the structure of this story, of this book, of how it's laid out. So what you have is, many years later, someone confesses to being this killer, and the original detectives are interviewing them to find out if they really are or not. And the investigation, it's like 18 years into, since these crimes had been committed, or since a certain crime had been committed. It's 18 years or 19 years since, and they're going back and revisiting the case in stories, in interrogation, and sometimes physically. And then it flashes backwards to various points of time, all the way to before he was a cop, or all the way to before he got onto this case, and then through the thing. But that non-linearity of it, and that sort of much drier, almost subverting, it's not about whether you're going to catch the guy or how they catch the guy. It's, have we got the guy? Is he the guy? How do we prove he's the guy? How do we know that? And then the politics of that, of how they have to keep it a secret, because the public can't get to know that someone has just walked in and said that they're the killer. And the fact that they've got to confirm whether this person is telling the truth or not in secrecy, but go over this old case, makes for a terrific structure that, because I think of the clean presentation, and it's very dynamic, but very non-show-offily. Because of this, you don't have any confusion. The haircuts, the size of the paunch, these things are modulated perfectly to let you know where you are, what point of time you're looking at. Oh, this is back again 5 years. Okay, this is 2 years before that. This is all the way at the beginning. Facial hair changing. These things are difficult. When they're not done right, they really stand out, and people have complaints like, I didn't know what was going on, or I didn't know who the characters were, or who was talking to whom. There is no such problem in this book. I think it's a terrific investigation story. It's not for people who want to hear about grisly crimes in detail over and over again, although there is a little bit of that, but it's about that wanting to know the truth, wanting to get to the truth and investigating, which makes it a great nonfiction story on so many levels, because of the kind of things that we're talking about is what's the difference between fiction and nonfiction, what's made up and what's true, and wanting to know because that makes a difference. I mean, we know that fiction is great and we know that it will comment on our world and our lives, but we're still drawn to nonfiction because there's still an allure of something that is true. And this is sort of a not a reversal of it, but this is looking at it from another point of view, that when you get to things like justice for the people killed or the closing of a case that detectives have spent almost 2 decades on, when you get, it's like, yes, the truth is important, yes, but does it matter, why does it matter? Those are the kind of questions that also come up in this crime detective serial killer story, which I thought was really complex and really nice, something I appreciated a lot about Green River Killer by Jeff Jensen and Jonathan Case. Okay. Now, I think I've earned my right for my... Is this only my second sip of the evening? I may have missed one somewhere. All right, moving along. What do we have next? Green River Killer, True Detective Story, 2012. 2013 is a tie. The first tie that we're seeing, we've got Annie Sullivan and the Trials of Helen Keller by Joseph Lambert, and The Carter Family, Don't Forget the Song by Frank M. Young and David Lasky. Okay, so I have never heard of The Carter Family, Don't Forget This Song, and that's a real shame because it's an Eisner winner for Best Nonfiction. I'm guessing that it's about June Carter, and that's the Carter family because it says Don't Forget This Song, but I really don't know anything about this comic. It is something that I'm going to... I think I may have looked this up, but I think I wasn't even able to find an entry for it. So that's odd, given that it's Abrams. And Abrams was also the publisher of the first two, I think, the first two winners, the collected edition of Nat Turner that we looked at. And no, I think it's Houghton Mifflin for Fun Home, but I'm not going back because I've moved them out of the way. There's a pile over here, so I had to move things out of the way. But okay, so the first tie that we see, Carter Family, I'm going to have to give myself a 0 for all of this. But also, Annie Sullivan and the Trials of Helen Keller by Joseph Lambert is a book that I have. Oh, I forgot to put this on the screen, didn't I? Sorry, everyone. Yeah, here you go. But yes, as I was saying, The Carter Family is not a book I know of. It's not a book that I've read. I do have the other book on this with the tie, which is Annie Sullivan and the Trials of Helen Keller by Joseph Lambert. Now, I have to confess that this is my most recent of all of these reads. In fact, I did not know about this book until last year when I was looking through the list of Eisner winners for some other category. And it just caught my eye because it was not a familiar book and it was on the list. So I got this and I have only very recently read this book. But I'm going to count it over here for the scoring. But I thought I should let you know that this is not coming straight off my shelves as a long... as something that's been in my collection for a very long time. But this is, well, first of all, the Center for Cartoon Studies is the publisher of this, and the Center for Cartoon Studies was also the publisher for the James Sturm, Rich Tomaso book that we saw earlier, Satchel Paige. And when looking at the back of this, when I had finished this and I was looking through the credits as far as this is concerned, Joseph Lambert is an Eisner and Ignatz winning writer, artist of comics. The editor for this book is Jason Lutz of Berlin. And the series editor for these books is James Sturm. So that's a pretty impressive... I've got to look at the Center for Cartoon Studies. They've got such an academic sounding name. And it sounds... well... maybe that's just my own prejudice, but I didn't know that there was a Center for Cartoon Studies founded by James Sturm that is publishing comics like this and Satchel Paige. It's really one of those things where you're like, oh, I've got to look at what else they've published. But getting to I'm going to take the dust jacket off. Getting to Annie Sullivan and the Trials of Helen Keller. This is obviously based on the Helen Keller, Annie Sullivan story. If you're not familiar, Helen Keller was a turn of the century sort of phenomenon in news and in stories as a woman who had been deaf and blind since 18 or 19 months of age and had somehow miraculously something that gets used a lot, been able to learn to communicate, read and write, go to school, and even get a degree. And then she was world famous. Everyone had heard of Helen Keller, and by proxy, Annie Sullivan, the woman who had, when Helen was a child, who had taught her. And that story has been done in theater and in film a number of times before. I was familiar with the story of the miracle worker, and I'd also a long time ago read an extract in a book from, I think, Helen Keller's autobiography. She wrote an autobiography. So I'd read an extract from it, the most famous scene, which I think many people will know, even if they don't know everything about Helen Keller, which is when the water overflowed from the pitcher and she was able to understand the concept of water as it was being given to her in finger language. I knew that scene and I knew the story of Helen Keller in a very rough way. And that was another thing, along with the Center for Cartoon Studies. And I was like, I wasn't sure what to expect from this slimmer book. And it's like, is it going to be something that I have seen before? And is it just going to be some history? Or, I mean, it's a fascinating story, but is it going to be anything new? And immediately, from the very first page, it was, with the depiction of Helen as a blind and deaf girl and what her experiences are and what she is feeling and how she's interacting with things that she can smell or that she can touch and then other forces around her. From that very first page and the second and the third, I got the feeling that this wasn't a standard sort of of course, I would be very interested in seeing how is a comic going to get across that experience. And I'm like, this is going to do that. It's going to bring across the comics medium to tell this story, not just illustrate something we already know. And then when it switches or when it starts giving you the more traditional comics thing, you still have, which side of it is it? It's mirrored. There we go. You've still got these things, which is what Helen is thinking and what Helen is feeling, really. It's her world. It's her sensory world compared to the world that we know with colors and shapes, etc. And of course, what this does, which might be for most people, the first thing that you realize when you start reading like this is that, oh, that water scene, this is where it's going to tie in there, isn't it? I mean, it's going to be something like this, and it doesn't disappoint. It definitely does that. But what it does is it really lives up to the title where it says Annie Sullivan and the Trials of Helen Keller, because this is as much a story of Annie as it is of Helen. It's very much about who the teacher was. And the things that are shown over here and the things that are put across are done so with such honesty that you can see the violence in their relationship. And again, if you're familiar with this story and if you've seen dramatization, you might have seen some versions of this where Helen is absolutely uncontrollable. She's almost like a wild animal because she's unable to communicate. She's unable to cognitively function with everyone around her. And the way that her teacher has to wrestle with her and pin her down and force feed her or refuse to give her food until she signs for it properly. These are all things that are given to us in these panels over and over again, moment by moment, in a way that truly starts feeling exhausting for us. At the same time, we are given Annie Sullivan, who's just an incredible character, someone who was an orphan and almost blind herself, someone who moved to teach Helen at the age of 20 because she had nowhere else to go and nothing to her name. These are things I didn't know. And so then you've got this historical book, nonfiction, giving me information, giving me things that I did not know, but also putting it across in a manner where the anger at the world around you and how that can be bridged, how language does that, I think made it a shockingly great comic in so many ways. There's a lot I can say about this book, but I really think if you can find it, I don't think it's that hard to find. I think this is one of those little gems that I wouldn't have found if it weren't for this list and this game. But I'm really happy I did, because this is a superb comic. Even the story that it tells, from the point of view of information I didn't have, it's just me being ignorant. But the trials of Helen Keller, that's a little bit of a pun, because it's not just about the difficulty of, but she was actually put on trial. I mean, not a real trial. It was more of a disciplinary, judicial hearing for plagiarism. This is not something I knew. And even that's about, and what that trial is about, and what that ends up doing, and what that ends up saying is, what is fiction? What is not fiction? What is mine? What is my thought? Did I get it from someone else's language? These are really complex questions told in this very slim story, which I thought would be like, oh, here's an inspiring story of overcoming all odds. Yes, it is. It is inspiring. It is overcoming incredible odds. But I had no idea about it's a little facile. Of course, I have no idea what it's like to be in that situation, but I had no idea about the kind of resistance and the kind of fights that were in front of Annie Sullivan as a child herself, and then her as a teacher and her methods, and then the kind of criticism faced after Helen Keller became famous. And to pack all of that into something so slim, to do it with such power, I think was unexpected. As I said, a real gem. Highly recommend Annie Sullivan and the Trials of Helen Keller by Joseph Lambert. All right, so that is, in the case of this, I can give myself points, but nothing for the Carter family, which, if any of you have read it, I'd love to know more about it. I don't think I found anything much on it at all. Okay, I got a haircut. My haircut was given to me by my wife, who is really good at this, apparently. This is the second time she's given me a haircut, and she was saying that maybe it should become an annual thing now. Every year before the summer, she gives me my haircut. All right. I'm just checking to see. You can't see the spreadsheet. Oh, that's when I had forgotten to put the spreadsheet up. Sorry about that. Yes, but hopefully you can see it now. Oh, year 2013. Oh, we're almost there. Look, I'm moving fast. I told you it wouldn't be that long this time. 2014, The Fifth Beatle, the Brian Epstein story by Vivek J. Tiwari, Andrew C. Robinson, and Kyle Baker. Kyle Baker wins another for nonfiction. There we go. Who knew? The Fifth Beatle is, of course, a book that I do own and have read, because I say, of course, because I made a video featuring this, not this exclusively, but in one of my recent reads videos. I think it might have even been a live stream. And this was another terrific, surprising book. I don't know Why I resisted reading this book for a long time. First of all, I didn't know anything about Brian Epstein. I had no idea who Brian Epstein was, other than that he was the manager, but I didn't know that he was such a big deal as far as the Beatles story was concerned. But even if I had known that, I was just like, it's one of those perennial things. It's like, is it going to be something that I don't know about and would be interested in? Is it going to be something new? Is it going to be something exciting? Or is it just going to be, look how famous they are, look how much, how successful they were, those kind of stories. And I know that sometimes people like, well, why would you expect that? But that's because I think there are so many, especially with nonfiction comics and especially with biographies of famous people, particularly when there's something you think you can teach, and because it's in comics form, I at least have encountered a number of really boring books, really boring comics, very not interested in being comics, not interested in good storytelling, but just sort of thinking that this is a way to get children to read about someone famous or to read about someone historically significant. And that sort of remedial, coating the medicine with sugar sort of approach almost always, I won't say always, but almost always results in a very flat storytelling and things that I don't respond to. I've been proven wrong before, and this is a very good example because I don't know why I thought of this was along those lines. Of course, it wouldn't be being a dark horse book. Wait, it is a dark horse book, isn't it? Yes, it is a dark horse book. Not as bold with their advertising on this one as others. But really quickly, because I have talked about this before, this book was very surprising because the story of Brian Epstein is a fascinating story, and the manner in which he made the Beatles who they are while being closeted, while being a gay man when it was illegal to be gay in the UK, and the kind of life that he led as a result of that, right next to fame and fortune. I mean, he was very rich himself. He was rich before he ever met the Beatles. But the story of a guy who wouldn't take no and who didn't want the world to be one thing and just believed in whatever he believed in so strongly, while being unable to do anything about another part of his life because it was so, it just wasn't a way that he could live. That push and pull between having it all and not having things leads to a very somber sort of tragedy, which is beautifully depicted over here. The artwork is very it's very evocative, it's very stylish. At times it's very realistic, at times it becomes almost abstract. Things can dissolve and the backgrounds can sort of work into becoming the background of another scene. Just a terrific comic with a lot of different styles and a lot of different approaches in its pages. And then there's a section which the Beatles go to the Philippines, which is done in an absolute manic, madcap Plastic Man style by Kyle Baker. That one section is what Kyle Baker draws. The rest is Andrew C. Robinson, with terrific writing by Vivek J. Tiwari. The Fifth Beatle, which I will give myself some points for. One for red, one for own. There we go. That's 2015 done with. 2016. March, Book 2 by John Lewis, Andrew Aiden, and Nate Powell. March, Book 2, for some reason, well, not for some reason, but when looking through the nominations, I did see that March Book 1 had been nominated in the previous year and lost to The Fifth Beatle. So for those of you who do not know, March, this is March Book 1. March is a trilogy. So there are 3 books in the March series. March Book 1, March Book 2, and March Book 3. This is March Book 2. This is March Book 3. and they're all, let me switch this. And they're, sorry, just, they're all available in this box set, the March box set, which comes in a slipcase. And I knew very little about Senator John Lewis when I read this. I knew about the Million Man March and the civil rights movement, of course, again, mainly from pop cultural movies and TV shows, a couple of documentaries. But this is an autobiographical take on that. So it's from one point of view, but also contextualizing the entire thing. The reason why I originally had picked up March was because of Nate Powell, whose work I'm a big fan of. And I've talked about a couple of his books, Any Empire, Swallow Me Whole. I was blanking on that. The Silence of Our Friends, which he drew, which I thought was a really great book, also set in the civil rights era. And March, book 1, book 2, book 3. I don't really think we can talk about them as separate books. They really are part 1, part 2, and part 3. You can end with book 1, but you're not going to feel like you've reached the end. You've just gotten to a certain part of the story and you'd want to continue further. So I would say, although they are 3 separate books and distinct books, I would almost treat them as one book put together. But they are about separate things and about separate times, and they do deal with separate politics and separate decisions and situations. For anyone interested in the civil rights movement, I think this book, all 3 of them put together, is terrific because it's not too dense, it's not too frivolous. It's by focusing on a particular couple of people and by focusing on a particular point of time, I think what it does is gives you a good sense of just how wide and how it's almost counterintuitive. You would think that you would need to have 100 people to create the sense of expanse, but what this book does is takes that individual focus and makes it universal. So I don't really have much to say about March because it's one of those books that you can see people will use in classrooms, and at the same time I think is not just a textbook, and I don't mean that in any disparaging way, but it's not just, there's a humanity and there's a generosity to it that is far more literary than teaching, although teaching I think is a big part of it. And I think that might be, I'm looking at these books over here. I think that might be a part of a lot of them. I don't know if the fifth Beatle is trying to teach you something. I saw a comment that, well, what if you're not interested in the Beatles? I mean, that's okay. I think when reading a comic, I've often found myself not interested in the thing the comic is about, but finding the comic pretty great. A good example of that is the nonfiction work of Box Brown when he wrote about wrestling, Andre the Giant. I have no interest in professional wrestling. I've never been interested in professional wrestling. I've had a lot of arguments and conversations with people who try to tell me professional wrestling is amazing. But the comic is superb because it makes me look at professional wrestling in a different way. Not that I'm going to start enjoying it, but it tells me and shows me things that I may not know. But most of all, it's a good comic in how it tells a story and where it finds the drama, in which moments it chooses to put across, which is, I think, what happens with great nonfiction as well. Sometimes it can be on a topic that I previously had no interest in, many times not even know such a thing existed, and then the work is what makes my interest, and that's what my interest is actually centered on. So I would say that even if you're not interested in the Beatles, I think the Fifth Beatle is an interesting story about the man behind one of the most popular bands in the world and what he was going through and how he was doing his job at a time and the world around him, which is the part that that I didn't know of and which I appreciated most about that. But yes, so March book 2 is something that is on this list and is something that I own, and I'll give myself a score for it right now. And I'll quickly also do that for 2017, because if I remember correctly, 2017 is March book 3. Again, this is a Two Towers Return of the King situation, I think. This is one work. I treat it as one work coming across, published across 3 volumes and 3 books. Superb stuff. Senator John Lewis, Andrew Aden, and Nate Powell. Okay, so we're already at 2017. That means I only have 4 more to go. Cheers. All right, let me pause and see if there are any questions. Although there's never any questions for me. People are just chatting amongst themselves. Did we skip 2015? Ooh, that's a good question. Let me check if I skipped 2015. What was 2015? We did skip 2015. Thank you. I was wondering about that because I did have my books up in order and I was wondering what this book is doing over here. Thank you, Tommy. Eagle-eyed as always. We shall clear. All right, here we go. So 2015 was Hip Hop Family Tree, Volume 2 by Ed Piskor. And this is Hip Hop Family Tree. This is Volume 1 and Volume 2. There are a total of 4 volumes total. So you've got Volume 1 and Volume 2, and they were put together in this nice little slipcase. You've got Volume 3 and Volume 4, and they were put together in a nice little slipcase. A nice big size Ed Piskor style and colors, which I think have now been made very popular by X-Men Grand Design. This is, I guess, I would say, I have not read a lot of Ed Piskor before this. I've read some of his stuff with Harvey Pekar. But yeah, this is, so Volume 2, the second volume, is the one that wins in 2015. I think I saw the first volume nominated in 2014, but it lost to, oh, I think maybe Hip Hop, I'm not sure, but if we missed 2015, Hip Hop Family Tree Volume 2 is the one that beat March Book 1 in 2015, and Volume 1 was beaten by The Fifth Beatle, if we are keeping track of the nominations. But if you have not seen this comic, this is a gloriously old and faded, purposefully so, colored comic that is quite, I would have to say, exaggeratedly in the look of comics of the time, artwork of the time, including newspaper comics, but also graffiti, street art, that tells the story of hip-hop in America. And here's a thing that I didn't know much about at all. My exposure to hip-hop has been very, what's on the charts and what's in the Billboard 100, and that too from a much later time than when the music was originating. So a lot of the music that is being talked about over here is stuff that I excavated much later in life. But this approach, and I think that's the Hip Hop Family Tree approach, might be the approach that not just the style and the color and the paper, but also the approach might be something that affected Grand Design, which is that straight bullet through time chronological approach of this happened, then this happened, then this happened, this person came into the scene, that person did that, this person did this, and it's just relentlessly moving forward. It's challenging you to sort of absorb what you have absorbed, because there's so much more to come that there's really no time to stick around and wallow in things. This does not mean that it's purely narrative. I think one of the great things about Hip Hop Family Tree, like a lot of great nonfiction, is which scenes and which incidents and which exchanges of dialogue, that are recorded somewhere, that are noted, that people remember, or eyewitness accounts tell you about, which one of those to put across and how that represents what this is talking about, which is the growth and the birth of a new form and the increased popularity of it and the way that it captures the public and the public imagination. All 4 volumes, I think, are extremely fun to read. They are dense and there is a breathlessness to them, especially if you're not familiar. It'll be turning back and going back and checking something. But what I will say is that the depiction of all of the artists and all of the characters in this, although done in, what might seem like a simplistic cartoony style, is extremely effective. I didn't really have much trouble remembering the people, because they're, this is that person's hairstyle. They wear a jacket with a collar, this yellow collar. This person has these kind of glasses or sunglasses. Those 1 or 2 elements to signify who is who made things absolutely easy. It's more difficult to remember the name of the records and the albums and the collaborations, but the people. And I can see this being, if you, for example, are not familiar with these artists and you read this, I can see this, when you're getting to the 80s or 90s, to be the way that someone thinks. If you've never heard of Salt and Pepper, you can think of Salt and Pepper the way they appear in this comic from now on. When anyone says Salt and Pepper, it's that kind of iconic representation that has the possibility of becoming the way you think of people, or becoming what you see in your mind when you think of some of these larger than life characters. So thank you for pointing that out, Tommy. 2015 was Hip Hop Family Tree Volume 2, 1 point, 1 point. And we've moved on from 15, 16, and I think we did 17 as well, right? 17 would have been March Book 3. That's right. Okay, so now we're on to 2018. Sorry, I forgot to switch this too. All right, so now we're going on to 2018. And 2018 is Spinning by Tillie Walden, which is a superb book that I've talked about a couple of times now. I read this, I guess, in 2018 because everyone was talking about Tillie Walden. Tillie Walden was kind of a sensation, is still, but a sensation for someone who was very young and created work that seemed extremely accomplished. And my first experience with her work, I think, was Spinning, and then I went back and read some of her older things, books that I could find. And Spinning is superb. This is a memoir. It's an autobiography. It's about Tillie Walden and the years she spent learning figure skating, competitive skating, which means that she was waking up early in the morning, going to the gym, practicing, touring. And it's this kind of sports story that you don't really see a lot of, but there's this incredible warmth, but also what's the way to put it? But this kind of, it's not like beauty pageants, and it's not quite as icky as children being in beauty pageants. It's very athletic. But the kind of commitment and the kind of energy that is required, the kind of discipline that is required, and the effects that it has on life of a young girl, I think, are superbly depicted in this. And some of my favorite parts of this book are the spaces of these institutional spaces, like the school or the gym or the pool, at times when no one is there, before the sun has risen, and the practice of these girls and their friendship and their camaraderie. But there's also this, it's not quite as warm and fuzzy as you would think. There is an honesty, almost a brutality to the lives. And I don't want to make it sound like they're soldiers in war or something like that. And that, I think, is one of the things where, again, like many of these books, where I was surprised, because I didn't think a bunch of girls figure skating and going on tour for competition would be of interest to me. But the loneliness, the sadness, the thrill, the joy of competition, the peace when you remove yourself from it, the kind of things that this book talks about, I think are very universal. You can take out the skating and you can take out the fact that they're teen girls, and you can substitute that for a number of different things, and I think get to the same feelings that this book evokes. The things where you're fond of something and not fond of something at the same time. When you look back at something and you have some sort of nostalgia, but you also don't like it. So that balance of liking and disliking something, of yearning for it and being glad it's gone, trying to remember who you were when you were in the throes of it from a time that you're no longer in the throes of it. These could apply to so many things in life. And that's why I think this works so well as a coming of age story. It's really maturely done to say that there are things that are our entire lives at some point of time, and then we move past them. And does that mean that they never happened? Does that mean that they will always be with us? Or is it something in between? It's quite complex, but it's not spelled out. It's just sort of there. And you can see this is quite a thick book compared to some of the dense works that we have seen about incredibly serious topics. This is a lot more pages on something. Again, I'm not comparing subject matter, but if you thought of, it was the war of the trenches, this is because of the amount of time that it is willing to give moments and the amount of time it is willing to give spaces. I think Spinning is a superb book. I think Spinning is a book like Gillian and Mariko Tamaki's This One Summer is a book that you can hand to people who don't read comics, that you can hand to people and say, how about this? Does this, this is nonfiction, nostalgia, autobiography. How does this work for you? And I think you will find success with that. And I think people who read comics all the time will also find it very, very admirable. So there you have it. Tilly Walden's Spinning 2018 from First Second, one of my favorite publishers. And I give myself some points for that. All right, moving on. 2019. Oh, we're almost at the end over here, I think. Yes. 2019. Is this guy for real? The Unbelievable Andy Kaufman. I think it's also time for a sip. The Unbelievable Andy Kaufman by Box Brown, also from First Second. All right, so regular viewers of this channel will know that I have this book. I love this book. I made a video on Box Brown, Cannabis, Tetris, Andre, and Andy. Those are the 4 books I talked about, and I recently made a video on his latest book, Child Star. But the Andy Kaufman book is a superb book. You can check out my video in which I talk about this book in detail, so I'm not going to go into it a lot. Box Brown has a very unique, and what I would say is, hold on, let me change the camera angle. What I would say is a deceptively simple style. It looks very childlike, but the compositions are actually great, and it's very clear, it's very clean. But there's something about this art style that really allows me to get into his story and his art. It's simple in a way that makes it accessible, and then it gets to be complex. And by that I mean, in all of his work, whether it's the book on Tetris, whether it's the book on Andy Kaufman, but on Andre the Giant, on cannabis, he's able to get to more than what you think any one scene or any one situation is about. And he'll create a collage of incidents and scenes, and then he'll give you this sort of thread that ties them all together in a fantastic way. And this book, I think, is the book that made me understand Andy Kaufman in a way that maybe I hadn't really understood him before. I didn't get what the big deal was in certain cases. I had watched that Miloš Forman movie with Jim Carrey in it, but it didn't really tell me other than, him being a guy who liked to laugh and make people laugh, I guess. But this book, I think, was a much clearer picture of the character, of the person, and the person being an artist, and the person being a performer, and the person being an entertainer, and what he thought about entertainment. And so you've got talk shows that he attends, TV and movies that he does, wild kind of things that he does with professional wrestling. His entire life story is in here in a way that I think is extremely accessible, but also very touching. And there's a coda right at the end of it where Box Brown is talking to Andy Kaufman's brother or sister, and they say, I really didn't like that movie because it made him look like a buffoon. And I felt bad when I was reading that, and Box Brown feels bad. And it was it was an interesting moment, because this is also the thing of nonfiction. Technically, that movie is also nonfiction. It's dramatized, but how you tell a story and what you choose to put up there and how long you choose to linger, they all make a difference to that impact that you have, to that the effect you have on the reader or the viewer. And the fact that you could take the same person with the same kind of incidents, the Elvis impersonation and the illness, and you could take the same thing and make such a different picture come into the minds of the same viewer. I watched the movie, I read this comic. This is why this is why nonfiction will never ever be one thing, but this is why it's also about what you choose to tell and how you choose to tell it. If you haven't read any Box Brown, I highly recommend Box Brown. I think this is a great first Box Brown book to read. Tetris is a fantastic book. Andre the Giant really surprised me because, at least with Andy Kaufman, I was kind of interested. Andre the Giant, I wasn't interested in at all. So I wouldn't call this, there's no best book in it. It all depends on which one. But this is the one that won an Eisner for best nonfiction, for best reality-based work. The Unbelievable Andy Kaufman, a biography written and drawn by Box Brown. All right, let's see what else we have. That was 2019. Is this guy for real? I'll give myself... And 2020. They Called Us Enemy by George Takei, Justin Eisinger, Stephen Scott, and Harmony Becker. George Takei is not someone I've really followed outside of Star Trek, but I know that he is quite an activist. I know that he is quite witty online. These are things that other people have told me. I will confess that when I heard that he was going to write a graphic novel with 3 other people, I wasn't sure what I thought of it. I always have one of those, and because I don't know whether he's a writer or not, whether this is the first time he's writing, I had no idea what it was going to be about. Then when I heard about it, They Called Us Enemy, about the internment camps for Japanese citizens in the United States during the Second World War, something that he went through as a child. I was like, okay, that's as an autobiography. I don't know what I was expecting, some science fiction or something, but it started making more sense and I got more interested. But I still only read this after a number of people had said, it's fantastic. You have to check it out. And I have to say that, again, these are the kind of things that I don't really understand. I don't understand why I have reservations. I don't understand what I'm expecting or where the prejudices are coming in. It's funny that someone being famous is something that prejudices me. But this is done in a manga style. It's not purely, it's a nice hybrid of Japanese and American comics. And I think that's very intentional. And I think that's just one of the things that this book does very smartly. It's not obviously a feel-good story, and it is about a time in history where people and their identity was so openly disparaged or challenged that it was okay to round them up and put them in camps. And then, of course, you get through the entire story. You get through the entire story of how a child in this situation deals with things, how his parents help him deal, but also what kind of an impression they have of the country they live in and the people they're surrounded by, what kind of feelings of self and other come through all of this. Of course, that's most evident in the title. They called us enemy. But it also does end on a note in which how much has changed and what are things like right now. It feels that it could be preachy, and I won't say that it doesn't have its moments in which its emotionality is right out there speaking to the reader, but it was not anywhere near as treacly or as loud as I was afraid that it would be. In fact, it was quite gentle. It was quite wise and quite a wonderful read, in spite of all of my misgivings or prejudices, none of which have any logical base. But they called us enemy, winner for best reality-based work for 2020. And then our final year, 2021, since the EISNERs have not happened this year yet, 2021. And the winner was Kent State, 4 Dead in Ohio by Durf Backdurf. Sorry. Yeah. Kent State is a massive, in many ways, book. Not just in the number of pages it has, which is substantial, but again, not huge. But this is the kind of stuff that I wonder why we have a category that's best reality-based work, that you could have something like this alongside something like this, alongside something like this. It just doesn't make sense after a while to have them all in the same category. Although, of course, it it's probably true for all categories. If you have something that's best writer, it's like, how do you compare someone who's writing this to someone who's writing that? But just when you create this category, you don't realize the kind of stories that can get in there. And Kent State it's like, someone we haven't seen on this list, and we haven't seen a number of people on this list. A number of my favorite nonfiction comics aren't on this list. One of the reasons being because it only started in 2006. So anything that was published before 2006 is obviously not here. So Mouse is probably one of the things that most people will think of. Even Persepolis is something that was before 2006. But also Joe Sacco. And we haven't seen any Joe Sacco on this. And Joe Sacco being one of the first nonfiction comics I read as an adult, well, nonfiction comics creators I read as an adult, was very formative to me. So Joe Sacco has a has a book, Footnote in Gaza, which is an incredible piece of excavation and archaeology into find out what happened. And there's so little on it that he has to conduct these incredible face-to-face interviews with survivors and people who lived in the village. It's an incredible work, and Kent State is sort of one of the opposites of that, but very similar in what it's doing. It's creating this tapestry through archaeology, but with things that are on record and recorded for the most, which is the, well, I mean, the subtitle says it right there, is the shooting at Kent State campus by the National Guard, who were called in because of college student protests, and then how things came to a head, and people died. And this is not just the incident, but this is everything leading up to it in painful detail, following characters in separate threads, in a magnificent story. I was very, here's the front cover without the dust jacket. I was very impressed by this story and by Derf Backderf's approach. Derf Backderf is famous for having written My Friend Dahmer, which is a comic I've heard about a lot. And talk about funny prejudices. That's another one that I didn't get when I first heard about it, because I didn't want to read about a serial killer from someone who was their classmate, because that's the way it was described to me. It's like, this person used to be Dahmer's classmate. And it felt, just this description of it. It was like, oh, you're going to go and find somebody who knew this person, and then they're going to say these things about us. But everything I've heard about that book is really, really good. And after reading Kent State, I'm definitely going to pick that book up. I mean, I knew that it was good and I should pick it up even before this, but it was just like one of those things. But Kent State is a terrific piece of journalistic writing, because what Derf Backderf does is he does have himself in it. There is, like what I've heard about My Friend Dahmer, there is a personal connection because he lived close to campus and he heard stuff from his parents, and he was a child when these things happened. But he sort of occupies a frame outside of the main story. The main story's characters are all presented in this rather interesting style. It's like a mixture between, I don't know, Crumb and Rick Geary. It's neither totally cartoony and caricaturish, nor is it realistic. These elongated faces that at first I was a little curious about how are these going to work, but it doesn't matter. After 2 pages, the expressions and the kind of conversations that these people are having seems like the most natural style to use, because of that way that it kind of reminded me of Crumb and some more of the underground artists from the 70s. And now it's talking about civil unrest, and it's talking about protests in the 70s. There seem to be a sort of, in my little brain, seem to have that sort of match as well. But what is the most, I think, among many, many things to praise about this book, what is the most gripping is the way that he takes dozens of characters from all walks of life who are on this fateful day at Kent State, in the National Guard, in the students, and he just brings it all together into this thing that you can hear almost the ticking of a bomb about to go off, because you know kind of what happened. I didn't know a lot of what happened, but even then I knew a little bit. I knew about the flower and the rifle, but there's a new context to it and it's put across in a different way. But even if you know nothing about it, this is like watching a recreation docudrama that takes you from 4 days before, from 10 days before, and sometimes flashes back to even further back to say how long had the National Guard been on duty, and what was the minor strike that was going. There was another strike going on that they were, and why was the governor so trigger happy at calling the National Guard? And it's creating this context for you in a way that to me was absolutely illuminating, because it was giving me information, it was giving me facts that I didn't have, but it was also creating this claustrophobia and this sense of doom as you could just it's like in slow motion, you're watching the pieces fall into place of what's going to happen. In that way, it reminded me of movies that have that sort of that slow drip building feeling, but with that ground on the ground reality, something like Paul Greengrass's Bloody Sunday. And it's like that, but it's a lot more stretched out, it's a lot more fleshed out, because you're not talking only about one day in real time, you're talking about all this time to these tragic consequences. And of course, it's inescapable to think about the kind of times that are being talked about here, and the kind of things that we are seeing, protests and government and military and police action and students and university campus hotbed of communism, and there's all kinds of things that don't, I think, with a lot of these books that aren't just of that time, but they have this resonance of saying it's still the same, and they're still commenting on things. They seem to be commenting on things that are going on today, and that we could encounter and face at any point of time. So highest recommendation. In fact, all of these books, I can't think of any of these books that I wouldn't say have been is enjoyable, but something like Kent State, I think, is worth reading. The only thing about Kent State, as I don't know if it's criticism or critique, is that it is so dense with information that very often you do have, especially at the beginning, you do have a lot of dialogue between the characters that comes across as a little expository, a little bit of a setup, like, so how you finding campus? And someone says, when I moved from Michigan 2 weeks ago, they're kind of spelling out to you. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that. And I don't think it continues for a long time. Just at the beginning, there's so much information to give that many times in nonfiction, you'll just have narrative text boxes. And there's a certain charm to that. And there's a certain power to that, where it's like, it would be, and he left never to return, or something, where the writer has more knowledge than the characters on the page. And that has a certain power. And a lot of these books actually use that. In the case of some books like Fun Home and Nat Turner, you're using transcripts, like from the diary, from the journal, from the confession. You're using exact text from that time and superimposing it with the language. In some others, you're manufacturing text to have as dialogue. And in some others, you're having a narrative voice comment. In Kent State, you do have that narrative voice give you that information, but a lot of it also comes through in conversation, and a lot of it also comes through in hey, thank you for the super chat, Tallman 7 T14. I thought it was a 7 now. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. But in Kent State, what happens is that you've got that narrative sort of caption boxes and information being given to you by the author or by the narrator, but it also happens a lot in dialogue, and it also happens a lot in character. So I thought that was interesting that Bechdel tried to take that approach of having the characters in their situation verbalize as much of the story or of the scenario. It was like, he's in no mood to do that, and he's not going to pull the trigger. Those kind of comments might be observational, but then larger ones, like he's just worried about losing the elections. I was like, this is interesting. But it worked for me because they are talking about college students and politically active college students and people who have a lot of opinions. So it didn't seem like unrealistic dialogue to me. It did seem like an interesting approach in getting that nonfiction story across. All right, so that is in some ways all of the work, but the one interesting thing happened in 2021, and that is finally this category at the Eisners, the best reality-based work, was split, and so Durf Backdurf's Kent State won best reality-based work, but a new category was created called best memoir. And now I'm guessing from now on, from 2021 onwards, there are going to be two nonfiction awards, which I think is a long time coming, because I do find it odd to put memoir alongside. Well, I mean, you could say biography and autobiography, and you could say that, well, it's not just reportage. You can have a third category called biography. But I think biography, for example, in Kent State, for example, in Hip Hop Family Tree, they can be about things that are not about one person's life. So it's not like Helen Keller and Annie Sullivan, for example. But you can't have that without biography. Even if you're talking about an incident, even if you're talking about a political movement, you will have multiple biographies. So in Kent State, you get 12, 13 biographies. I mean, they're very encapsulated. So I don't think that biography needs to be a separate category, but I do think that it's a very good idea that memoir is a different category and reality-based work, nonfiction that is non-memoir, is a different category, because I would really like to see more comics being nominated and more comics being talked about. And so when you have a personal story of childhood or a thing that you have gone through that you're writing about, and you're doing research into something in history, you're doing journalism, it would be good for them to have their own space. So but yes, Mouse. It's a very good comment that Mouse could win in both, and that is, I've found that to be the case for a number of stories. Mouse's model of like interviewing someone and having them tell their story and then putting their story down in art. That series of interviews and writing that story is a thing that we've seen a number of times before. Now I've seen that in a couple of Spanish comics, and I've seen that in a number of European comics, American comics for sure. You also have stories that can be part autobiography and part history, absolutely smashed together in the way that there's a book by Mary and Brian Talbot, Daughter of Her Father's Eyes, where it's essentially two stories, and one is my story and one is someone else's story. So I've seen that as well. So there'll always be hybrids and works that challenge these boundaries. But I think at one level, saying memoir versus nonfiction is a good idea. So the last book that I don't have it on the Excel on the spreadsheet, but the book that won is right here. So I'm gonna go grab it. 1 second. So in 2021, the winner for Best Memoir was Adrian Tomine's The Loneliness of the Long Distance Cartoonist, which I will talk about, I think, in greater detail, but just very shortly, this is his life as a cartoonist, his work as a cartoonist, and it's full of stuff that will be of great amusement, but also great pain and cringing for comics fans and readers, of being on the convention circuit, of being recognized, of not being recognized, of insecurity and constant questioning of their own work, their own worth. Very funny, which is Adrian Tomine's work can be funny. It is, sometimes people are surprised to see that, but this is closer to his Scenes from an Impending Marriage than, say, something like Shortcomings or the stories that are there in Killing and Dying. I wouldn't call them lighthearted, but they're not. You feel like giving him a hug. That's for sure. It's a great book done in a lovely style of self-effacement, insecurity, and then also a little bit of, well, is this fair? And that's something that the reader brings to it. But if we think about this as a separate category, now what I find interesting is how many of these books would not have been in the category that we just talked about. So here's a memoir. So just to end this, and I still have my whiskey. Just to end this live stream, what I would like to do is to say that how many of the books that we looked at, let me first look at my score and then we'll end this once and for all. So the final thing for this, and now I'm going to go ahead. 28 out of 34. All right. So that means that there are 3 books that I didn't get. 6 points missing because I neither own or read them. A Drifting Life by Tatsumi. I forgot to score myself for Green River Killer. Hello. It's not 3 books. It is 2 books, The Carter Family. So it is A Drifting Life that I have not read, that I do not own, and The Carter Family that I have not read and do not own. Everything else seems to be okay. So 30 out of 34, not too bad. And we'll say 32 out of 36 if we're counting the other 2021 winner for nonfiction in the memoir category. All right, so it's okay. I think this is this list actually kind of matches up with when I started reading comics again as an adult. It was around that 2005 period where I really got into it, and the years up to that, from say 2001 or even 2000, from 2000 to 2005, the seeds were being planted. Watchmen was read in that period of time, and Mouse was read in that period of time, but that didn't necessarily lead to me reading more and more comics. I was just reading a handful of comics here and there and going, comics are pretty good. But 2005 onwards, I was really into comics. I was looking for new writers. I was looking for new work. And so therefore, that's probably a reason why this lines up decently for me in this category. And it is a category, that I enjoy, nonfiction. So the last thing for this live stream is how many memoirs and how many non-memoirs. So if I'm saying we've got now 16 books with one tie, that's 17 books with one, that's 18 books. So out of 18 books, well, I won't count this. So 17 books, how many memoirs like this one? Can State, not a memoir. Is This Guy for Real? Not a memoir. Hip Hop Family Tree, not a memoir. They Called Us Enemy, memoir. That's 1. Spinning, that's a memoir. That's 2. Oh, I put all the books away, didn't I? By away, I mean I just threw them on the mattress on the floor. It Was the War of the Trenches, not a memoir. The Fifth Beatle, not a memoir. March, book 2 and 3, Yes and Yes, memoir. So that's 4 for memoir total. What It Is, memoir, that's 5. Green River Killer. Now, here's an interesting one, right? This is almost, not at the level of Mouse, but the author, Jeff Jensen, does appear in this book. It is about his father, but it shows you how those lines can be blurred. But I'll say this is not a memoir, even though this is about his father's investigation, not classifying it as such over here. Fun Home is definitely a memoir. And now we've got a couple of other interesting things where when we have Nat Turner, big extracts of Nat Turner, and a lot of what is drawn is from his confessions, which is a type of memoir. It's written by someone else, but it's written by someone transcribing it. So is that a memoir or is that not a memoir? But it's not a memoir because it's not written and drawn by the person who's writing and drawing the comic. So I think that's where we come to, at least one of the lines that we have to draw is that if I'm going to classify something as a memoir, it has to be written and drawn by that person. But what happens if you adapt something that someone wrote as a memoir in prose? Now, is it suddenly not a memoir anymore because they're not the artist of this? That's an interesting question. So I would say that there's 1, 2, 3, 4. I figured I could have done this better by actually just looking at the sheet instead of trying to pick all the books up from the floor. So Nat Turner, not a memoir, but does contain stuff from him. Fun Home, yes, a memoir. Satchel Paige, not a memoir. Drifting Life, one that I do not have, is a memoir. What It Is by Linda Barry is a memoir. We said Green River Killer isn't. Trials of Helen Keller. Annie Sullivan's letters and journals feature very heavily in the comic, and it uses a cursive font for the it's not a font, it's hand lettered in cursive whenever it's an extract from her letters or from her journal, and then in other fonts for Helen talking, etc. So it's kind of a memoir because some of her writing is in there, but again, she's not the writer artist of the comic. The Carter Family, no. The Fifth Beatle, no. Hip Hop Family Tree, no. March, yes. Spinning, yes. They Called Us Enemy, yes. And here's an interesting thing: They Called Us Enemies written by someone, but written by other people. So what happens if you collaborate with an artist on your story? Is that not a memoir, or is it half a memoir because it's not drawn by you? And then Kent State. So yes, there are a number of books that would be 6, 7 maybe books out of these 16 would not any longer be part of this category, and they would come up in the memoir category. All right. That's, I think, a good time to call it quits. Thank you so much for joining me. I did manage to make my way through this with only 4 sips. So this is, in fact, I was a little conservative. So I've got a large sip left for me over here. I do have work in the morning, but it's not going to go to waste. Thank you so much for joining me for this live stream. I hope you had a good time on this, looking through this, and I'd love to hear your opinions on nonfiction. And it's something that I really would like to get into a little bit more. I've been thinking about making a best nonfiction comics, but it's the same thing. I can't just create one category. I'll have to create many category. My favorite nonfiction comics. It's something that I've been thinking about for a long time, and will probably continue to think about for a while. But once again, thank you so much, everyone, for joining me. Have a good rest of the weekend, whatever you have left of it. Have a great week, and I'll see you at the next video. Good night.